going to vote in the primary or the general election, and what party are you voting for?
I am planning on voting in the general election. So I'm not really sure who I'm going to vote for. Probably an independent because I'm not really a fan of Trump and I'm not really a fan of Clinton. So kind of an independent's kind of a nice way to branch out from that.
I am going to vote in the primary. I am a registered Republican. I am going to be voting for Marco Rubio, even though he is out. He is still on the ballot for the primary, but that does not change the fact that he's still in my heart.
Yes, I'm going to vote in both. I'll probably vote for one of the Democratic candidates, but I'm still not decided which one. I mean, I'm not voting for Trump, so.
Do you think your vote makes an impact, and to what extent does your individual vote matter?
Voting makes an impact if only because it adds up. So I don't think my individual vote means much as itself, but because I know other people are also voting as well, if I didn't vote and if nobody voted because they didn't think that their vote mattered, then nobody would vote, and then obviously it wouldn't matter.
This is kind of a tricky thing because it's like one individual person's vote doesn't necessarily matter, but if there's a lot of people voting together, obviously that can make a difference. So I do still think it's important to vote, even though I know that one individual vote is not going to swing the election.
Do you think it's every person's responsibility to vote, and if so, should the government make it mandatory?
Yes, it is everyone's responsibility to vote. I want you to vote. And I do believe it should be mandatory to vote, but I also believe that it should be mandatory to make sure that the people who are allowed to vote have some basis for making that decision, right? So ideally, the voters are informed, not just politically, but economically, or even in the context of the history and traditions of the nation.
I think it is everybody's responsibility to vote because they choose to live in a country where they vote to decide on matters. Whether the government should make it mandatory or not, though, I think that infringes on individual rights, and I think it can get a little bit hairy. So I think it should be more encouraged and a little bit easier to vote, I would say.
The government should never make voting mandatory because you could have a circumstance like what we have right now with Donald Trump. Most of the GOP does not agree with Donald Trump as the prospective nominee, even though he will be the nominee because there's no one challenging him. I do think it is everybody's right to vote, or at least register to vote, and if they choose not to vote as an act of protest or because they don't like any candidate or they're not given any other option, I think that we shouldn't vote because that is not giving us enough options.
Do you think voting is an effective method of making decisions on important matters?
No, because it makes everyone think that what they say really matters a lot and that it's going to impact everything. So it kind of just pisses people off because then again, we're voting on representation. So it's super indirect and it gives people the illusion that they matter.
I think voting does help make decisions, but I think most important matters are decided by Congress and not by us voters.
I think voting in certain ways, and there's petitions like collecting signatures, I think that's really effective. But once you get up to government, outside of voting for representatives and elections and stuff, once you get, if you go down, if you think of Congress, how effective they've been with passing bills and stuff, you need a supermajority, majority, and whatnot. I think it's effective in a sense, but then ultimately the main things that have been passed have been presidential executive orders or something that doesn't really require a vote, only to repeal that.
What else do you do besides voting to stay politically active?
I'm on the Los Gatos Youth Commission, which is a student government part of the town, and I do plan to stay involved in student government when I go to college.
I go get signs and I go around places that are bad, and I make signs and I wave them in people's faces until they don't do anything. But that didn't really work, so now I just kind of read about stuff and complain about it in the classroom, because what goes on in the classroom really reflects what's going on in politics. So I figure if I complain to all my friends about things, it really helps polarize people and it gets people going. So I think that helps politics, and that's really active. So I'm moving my mouth a lot.
Yeah, you know what I do? I work out, because you don't get to look like this, from nothing. You have to really work out. Yeah, that's right. So I pump up all of my political muscles, that's what I do.
Voting is the #1 way Americans stay politically active. But even then, a lot don't do it. 54.9% of the eligible population voted in the 2012 presidential election, and only 36.4% voted in the midterms in 2014. It's a well-known fact that the U.S. trails dismally behind most developed countries in voter turnout. Several factors contribute to this. In America, voter registration is the responsibility of the individual. In most other countries, the government registers eligible citizens automatically. And while registering isn't supposed to be difficult, it can definitely pose a challenge to underprivileged minorities. Additionally, this two-step process is naturally fraught with human error. When voter information has to be entered from paper applications into state databases, mistakes are bound to happen, and these mistakes can prevent registered individuals from voting. The very placement of Election Day also poses a challenge. No other democracy holds elections on a Tuesday, an anachronistic remnant from the days when it took a full day to travel and reach the polls. To the modern voter, it can be inconvenient to take time off from work or school. And while most states offer early voting, 14 only offer Tuesday voting as an option, and that's hundreds of thousands of potential votes lost.
Finally, the U.S. lacks what several democracies possess, mandatory voting. In Australia, for example, requiring every eligible citizen to show up to the polls or have a valid excuse not to has changed the culture of politicians. Australian politicians say that knowing both parties' bases will certainly vote motivates them to focus on those persuadable voters in the middle. They don't emphasize the kind of wedge issues like guns, gays, or abortion that dominate American discourse. Instead, politicians focus on the bigger questions, like the economy, jobs, and education, that drive the voters in the middle, and they avoid the kind of vitriolic campaign rhetoric that turns off persuadable voters. While this sounds appealing, as does bringing America up from its 138th place out of 172 nations in voter turnout, it's unlikely that this country will ever entertain the notion of mandatory voting, especially since abstaining from voting is a form of free speech and protest. Obviously, a lot can be done to improve voter turnout in America, but is that even necessary? After all, 35% of Americans can't name a single branch of our government. Should these people be trusted to shape important decisions on healthcare, taxes, the economy, and religious liberty? And while we should be making efforts to mobilize certain underrepresented groups to vote as a whole, in the end, a person's choice whether or not to vote is his own. The important part is that the option exists, and we have the choice to be as little or as much politically active as we choose. Do you think it is every person's responsibility to vote, and if so,
Even though you feel like you don't matter, in the end you should, I'm not saying that very well. Does that make sense? Should I start that over?
If I'm gonna vote, I might exercise my right to not vote.
Bro.
Come on, dude.